What could possibly drive a father, and not just any father but a king, to throw his own son out after just 54 minutes behind closed doors? That is the question echoing through the corridors of power, rattling chandeliers inside Clarence House, and keeping newsrooms from London to Los Angeles on high alert. A meeting that was supposed to heal wounds turned into a scene so explosive that even palace veterans are whispering. Something dangerous happened inside that room. This was not just another family argument. This was the king, Charles himself, summoning his younger son for what many believed could be the beginning of reconciliation. Years of distance, bitter interviews, memoirs dripping with accusations, and media battles that made the royal household look like a medieval battlefield. It was all supposed to end with this meeting. For the first time in years, there would be no aides, no cameras, no scripted lines. Just a father and a son, eye to eye, perhaps ready to rebuild a bond once thought unbreakable. But why did it collapse in less than an hour? Why did Prince Harry leave that building with his jaw clenched, his eyes blazing, and his lips pressed so tight they seemed to swallow his own rage? Why did King Charles remain behind, refusing, according to whispers, to even glance at his son as he walked out into the gray London rain? 54 minutes? That is all it took to destroy what little hope was left. And the chilling question remains, what words were exchanged in that room that could override not just a father's instinct to forgive but a monarch's sacred duty to unify? Imagine the scene, the royal motorcade arriving quietly through the guarded entrance, the muffled echo of footsteps across polished marble, velvet curtains drawn tight shielding every move from the long lenses of hungry photographers. Clarence House, a place associated with tradition, stability, and restraint, felt that day less like a home and more like a powder keg disguised as a palace. Officially, this was just a private meeting. No cameras, no journalists, no aides, just two men carrying years of history into one room. Yet even before the meeting began, rumors circled like vultures sensing fresh prey. Some advisors suspected a trap. Others prayed it would finally end the bitter freeze between the House of Windsor and its most rebellious prince. But no one, absolutely no one, predicted that the entire encounter would implode so violently so quickly. Harry's arrival told its own story. No triumphant smile, no gestures of warmth. His face was a mask carved from stone. His suit a sharp navy-tailored piece seemed chosen to project tradition, perhaps even respect, but his restless eyes betrayed him. They darted toward windows, scanning for hidden lenses as if every shadow could conceal a camera. His stride was brisk, his head low. This wasn't a homecoming, it was an invasion. And though autumn had already draped London in cold air, the tension Harry carried with him made the atmosphere even frostier. Inside, Charles waited, not in any random chamber but in the morning room, a space carefully chosen, dripping with symbolism. Floral sofas, ancestral portraits, light filtering through antique windows. To an outsider it might look warm and inviting, but those who understand the theater of royalty know better. This was no neutral ground. This was a room heavy with authority, tradition, and continuity. It was where Charles had once sat with his mother to discuss affairs of state. By summoning Harry there, the king wasn't simply opening his door. He was reminding his son exactly where the power resided. And then their eyes met. The moment hung in the air, thick and heavy. No handshakes, no embraces, not even a polite smile, just a stiff nod from Charles and a rigid bow of Harry's head. A father and son standing only steps apart, yet separated by an emotional canyon carved through years of mistrust and betrayal. The silence stretched so long that, according to one account, even a royal footman flinched when Charles finally broke it. His first words were not a welcome, they were a question, cold, sharp, delivered like a dagger wrapped in velvet, and whatever he asked, it cut Harry to the core. The younger prince's jaw tightened, his posture stiffened, the confrontation had begun. Most accounts gloss over this moment. But to understand the explosion that followed, you have to realize the weight each man carried into that room. This was not simply a father facing his son. This was a monarch who had clawed his way through scandal after scandal to reach the throne, sitting across from a son who had detonated centuries of royal tradition in order to forge his own path. Charles had seen his public image obliterated during the Diana years, only to rebuild it piece by painstaking piece. And Harry, the once mischievous, beloved prince who had breathed life into the monarchy, had become its fiercest critic. Every sentence exchanged that day was not just personal, it was political. Each word carried the potential to dominate headlines, sway public opinion, or unravel alliances that had taken years to build. They weren't just speaking to each other, they were speaking to history. Sources suggest Harry attempted to break the ice with something trivial, perhaps a comment about the gardens or the weather. Charles cut him off instantly. He had a list and he intended to go through it point by point. Errors, betrayals, public humiliations. Each mention fell like a hammer strike against glass, cracking what little calm remained. And as the minutes passed, it became painfully clear this would not be a warm reunion. This was an inquisition. But then came the twist. The harsher Charles's words became, the more Harry's demeanor shifted. He did not erupt. He did not shout back. Instead, he grew colder, still, detached, the look of a man pulling inward, bracing himself for something. And it was then, whispers say, that the first rumors of a hidden recording began to circulate. Was Harry secretly taping the conversation? The palace denies it, of course, but the whispers persist. Witnesses noted something in the way Harry sat, the way his jacket shifted, the faint glow of a device in his pocket. Subtle signs, but enough to make palace staff uneasy. If Harry was recording, then every reproach, every raised voice, every royal confession could one day explode into the public domain. And if Charles suspected it, even for a moment, it might explain the sudden shift in tone, the explosion that followed. Meanwhile, outside, the press waited impatiently. Reporters shouted questions as cars passed by. Would there be reconciliation? Would the king forgive his son? No answers came, but through a narrow gap in the curtains, one photographer caught something chilling. The king, rising suddenly to his feet, his hands slamming down on the table. A flash of fury before the curtains were yanked shut again. 17 minutes still remained before the door opened, but in that instant the atmosphere inside Clarence House turned volcanic. Something snapped. And when the door finally swung open, the scene said more than words ever could. Guards stiffened. Rain hammered down. Harry emerged with fire in his eyes and stone in his jaw. Behind him, the king remained inside, unmoving, refusing, so it said, to even glance at the son who had just left. What exactly detonated in those 54 minutes? What was said that could shatter both paternal instinct and royal obligation in a single stroke? And more importantly, what happens next? Because if Harry did record that meeting, if even a fraction of what was spoken behind those closed doors leaks, the monarchy could be facing not just another scandal, but an existential threat. And here is where I turn to you. Do you believe Harry had a device hidden that day? Do you think Charles suspected he was being set up, or was this simply a father pushed beyond his limit, no technology needed? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you think really happened in those 54 minutes. And whatever the truth is, one thing is certain: this story is not over. In fact, it may be only just beginning. He did not shout, not exactly, but his voice was sharp enough, cold enough, that even those standing in the corridor outside froze where they stood. They say silence fell over the palace hallways like a sudden winter. And then Harry broke. His composure cracked, hands slicing the air as he argued back, his mask of calm shattering. What began as a tense exchange between father and son had transformed into a torrent of resentment, years of buried anger unleashed like a river finally breaking through a dam. The name Meghan cut through the air next, not spoken but hurled, spat like a curse. That was when everything shifted. Charles demanded explanations, demanded answers for interviews given, memoir passages that painted the family in shades of betrayal, accusations hurled across oceans. But Harry fought back, his words laced with bitterness. He threw childhood wounds on the table, memories of neglect, double standards, and the cold shadow cast by royal duty. It was raw, it was ugly, and it was no longer contained. Exactly 54 minutes into the meeting, it happened. The words that changed everything. Charles issued not advice, not a plea, but a command, 3 syllables that carried the full weight of the crown. You may leave. That was it, no warmth, no hesitation. His tone, according to one insider, was like ice fracturing on stone. Guards shifted almost imperceptibly, ready but discreet. Harry rose from his chair, first in disbelief, then in fury. His face flushed red, his breathing heavy. But he didn't beg, he didn't argue. He simply turned, brushing past a stunned servant, and strode down the corridor as though leaving behind not just a room but an entire life. The great doors opened. A gust of icy wind swept in like a blade. Outside, cameras flashed, hungry and relentless. And yet Harry did not look back. He walked into the storm of lenses and questions without a single glance toward the father he had just left behind. Inside, Charles sat frozen in the morning room, motionless, eyes locked on the window, jaw set like stone, and just like that, the meeting was over, not with reconciliation, not with the embrace of father and son, but with exile renewed and final, not with forgiveness, but with an order. And what came after would make that eruption look like a whisper. Because the world was about to find out what truly happened behind those doors, and no one was prepared. Ask yourself this: what kind of man willingly walks into the lion's den, knowing the lion may bare its fangs? That was the question on everyone's lips when Harry's black Range Rover rolled silently over the cobblestones of Clarence House that gray London afternoon. The air was heavy, metallic, the kind of stillness that comes just before rain falls, but the tension did not come from the clouds. It came from the rows of guards, their earpieces coiled like serpents, their eyes tracking every movement. This was not a welcome, it was surveillance. Harry stepped out, one polished shoe touched the ground. In that moment his face said everything, shut tight, watchful, eyes scanning window after window as though expecting to see a sniper's scope or a disapproving glare lurking behind every curtain. Slowly, almost ritualistically, he adjusted his cuffs, not vanity, preparation. A small act to center himself before walking into a confrontation disguised as reconciliation. Have you ever entered a room knowing every word you utter will be dissected, twisted, stored away as ammunition? That was Harry's arrival. Inside, palace staff stood aligned like chess pieces, 2 at the entrance, 2 in the courtyard, 3 more by the garden, faces blank, movements precise, protocol yes, but also intimidation. This was not the same Harry who once ran through those doors as a boy, knees scraped, laughter echoing down the halls, mischief sparkling in his eyes. That boy had vanished. In his place stood a man treated as an intruder. Behind those cream stone walls, Clarence House loomed in its paradox. To tourists it was elegance, a stately London residence for the monarch, but to those inside it was a fortress wrapped in silk. And on that day it was not a home, it was a stage. Curtains drawn halfway, just enough to darken silhouettes from photographers' lenses. Even the flowers by the entrance had been trimmed down as though any hint of softness might betray the meeting's true atmosphere. Outside, the sound of camera shutters rattled through the courtyard like distant gunfire. Dozens of photographers had been camped there since dawn, waiting for a single frame. They did not get a smile. They did not get a wave. All they captured was Harry's back, his posture upright, almost military as he marched toward the entrance. Some whispered among themselves, "Where was the cheeky grin, the boyish charm?" One muttered, "He looks like a defendant walking into his own trial." And then, the door opened before he reached it. A small detail, but in the choreographed world of royal protocol it was a tremor. It suggested control. It suggested surveillance. It suggested that from the moment Harry stepped onto the stones, every move had already been anticipated. Now picture this. Behind those closed doors, father and son face each other. The conversation begins not with warmth but with calculation, and with every passing minute the air thickens. Meghan's name detonates in the middle of the dialogue. Charles, wounded by years of public criticism, demands clarity. Harry retaliates with stories of childhood, accusations of favoritism, loneliness, and betrayal, his voice rising, his hands cutting through the air. The calm royal mask is gone. In its place, raw human emotion. And then those words, cold, final, irrevocable, "You may leave." It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a line drawn in history. Now here is where the story fractures into rumor and speculation. Some claim Harry had been secretly recording the entire meeting, that a faint glow from his pocket betrayed the presence of a device, that his posture, the way his jacket sat, the subtle flicker of his eyes suggested preparation. If true, then every word spoken, every accusation, every admission could one day explode into the public domain. Did Charles sense it? Did he see his son not just as a rebel but as a threat with evidence? If so, his cold dismissal makes chilling sense. Others say no device existed, that what broke Charles was not the threat of exposure but the sheer fury of years collapsing at once, that for all his kingly duty he could not contain the raw instinct of a father scorned. Either way, the world outside Clarence House had no idea of the storm brewing within. All they saw was the aftermath, a prince storming into the rain, a king staring silently through a window, and a silence so loud it screamed. And here is where the mystery deepens, because what happened after those 54 minutes did not stay within those walls. Whispers began to leak. Staffers who claimed to overhear raised voices. A photographer who swore he saw the king slam his hands on the table. Reports of Meghan's name echoing through the corridors. Each fragment feeding the fire, each rumor reshaping the narrative. And still, the most dangerous possibility lingers unanswered. If Harry truly recorded that meeting, where is the tape? Who holds it? And what would it mean if the world heard what a king said to his son in private? So let me ask you, if you were in Harry's shoes, would you have recorded that conversation? Would you have dared to capture history as it unfolded, even at the risk of destroying what little trust remained? Or do you think Harry walked into Clarence House armed with nothing but his own words, ready to fight with truth rather than tapes? Tell me in the comments, because one thing is certain, the truth of what happened in those 54 minutes has the power to shake the monarchy like nothing before. And the deeper we dig, the more unsettling it becomes. Normally, a visitor waits for the host to signal entry, but this time it wasn't chance. Someone inside had calculated the exact moment when the handle should turn, the precise second Harry's polished shoe touched a specific tile of the floor. The door didn't open as a gesture of welcome, it opened as a demonstration of control. A footman stepped back instantly, posture stiff as if standing to attention, gaze lowered, careful not to make eye contact. The message was unmistakable: respect the title, yes, but keep your distance from the rebel. As Harry crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The noise of the outside world, shouts of reporters, the click of cameras, the drizzle against stone was swallowed by thick walls. The silence was enormous, oppressive. He had walked these corridors hundreds of times before, but never like this. No longer as a prince at home, but as an exile daring to step inside forbidden territory. Every oil portrait that lined the walls seemed to glare down at him. Ancestors of the Windsor dynasty, Victoria, George, Edward, faces frozen in paint, judging him like silent jurors. He didn't stop walking, but his stride slowed. At the far end of the hallway, behind a lace curtain, a silhouette flickered briefly. Some say it was merely an aide, others swear it was Camilla herself, present yet invisible, haunting the room like a specter hovering over the battlefield. We may never know. But Harry noticed, his shoulders stiffened, his back tightened. He had felt the watchful eyes. He paused for just an instant before the morning room door. A hesitation so small it might have gone unnoticed, yet it carried the weight of an athlete at the starting line. Then he moved forward. And here is where the irony burns. Clarence House had once been his playground. Here he had lined up toy soldiers against the baseboards. Here he had curled on the very sofa that now stood in pristine condition, a relic of laughter long gone. That day every object seemed alien. The carpet too ornate, the lamps too rigid, the air itself perfumed to erase any trace of warmth. It wasn't home anymore. It was enemy territory disguised with floral upholstery. A tall clock loomed over the mantel, ticking with mechanical precision, each second loud, almost accusatory, like a countdown to something inevitable. 54 minutes later, its chime would sound like a gunshot. No one knew it yet, not even Harry. He scanned the empty room. Charles was not there. That too was deliberate. A show of power, make him wait, remind him who sits on the throne. An aide stood silently at the edge of the room. No words, no gestures, just presence. Harry remained motionless in the center of the carpet, hands clasped behind his back, his posture military, unyielding. He didn't pace, didn't fidget. He stood as if carved from stone, knowing every move would be reported. This too was strategy. He offered nothing, a blank face, an impenetrable mask, but beneath the surface the storm was building. The tremor of his jaw betrayed it, not just tension, rage. Rage contained, frozen, restrained. And then came the footsteps, slow, heavy, rhythmic, each step echoing down the corridor like a drumbeat of authority. Everyone in the room tensed. The aide bowed his head sharply, then slipped out. Those were not the steps of Charles the man. They were the steps of the institution itself. Centuries of monarchy, crown, scepter, and solemnity crushing the wooden floorboards under their weight. And Harry felt it more than ever, because the figure approaching was not simply his father. It was the embodiment of everything he had rebelled against. Something hardened in Harry's eyes, his temple tightened. He had not come to plead, he had come to endure. The door swung open. Charles entered, no smile, no extended hand. He moved to the center of the carpet and stopped exactly 1 meter away from his son, as though the gap between them was a border that could never be crossed. They stood there, statues locked in tension. No words, no gestures, just silence so sharp it hummed in the air. Finally, Charles inclined his head once curtly. Harry mirrored the gesture. The duel had begun, a silent battle of presence and willpower. And then it happened. A tiny flicker, barely visible, a red light pulsing faintly inside Harry's suit pocket. Almost no one noticed. Almost. One aide widened his eyes in shock, then quickly lowered them, because if that light was what it seemed, then the entire meeting was being recorded. If true, those 54 minutes would not be confined to memory. They would live on, every word, every sigh, every dagger of accusation captured forever. But before words came, there was silence. And in that silence, with the clock ticking louder, Harry spoke first. What he said would set the tone for everything that followed, and once uttered, there would be no turning back. Have you ever stepped into a place you once called home, only to feel like a stranger in every corner? That was the weight pressing down on Harry inside Clarence House, surrounded by a history that once embraced him and now rejected him. The door thudded shut behind him like the vault of a tomb. He had crossed the point of no return, no longer the estranged son, now the intruder, the adversary, the enemy who had breached the fortress. Clarence House has always been an enigma. To the public it looks modest, almost charming by royal standards, its cream-colored stone walls climbing with ivy flower boxes softening the facade. But inside it is not a home. It is a palace of discipline and control. Every carpet placed with military precision, every portrait positioned to radiate authority, every antique whispering the burden of lineage. This was not a house, these were crowned walls. They held centuries of weight in their silence, and for Harry that silence roared. He passed the grand staircase. Once it had been his racetrack, a slippery slide for him and William as boys, tumbling down polished banisters until nannies scolded them. Now, roped off with red velvet, it stood as a monument to what was lost. The child who belonged there was gone. In his place stood a man the palace considered a liability. Everything about the place screamed caution. Even the air was curated, a blend of beeswax and aged paper, the very scent of continuity. Harry's gaze flicked to the corners of the ceiling, half expecting to spot hidden cameras, because that was Clarence House now, not warmth, control. Even hospitality had been weaponized. From the far corridor a shadow moved. Not Charles, not yet. Another figure, silent, watching. Some whispered it was an aide, others dared to suggest Camilla herself, unseen but omnipresent, the queen consort lingering just beyond the stage, a ghost at the feast. Harry felt it. Every instinct told him this was no neutral ground. This was a chessboard, and he had already been placed in check. And then the steps grew closer. The king had arrived. What followed inside those walls would unravel decades of family bonds, spark rumors of secret tapes, and ignite speculation so volatile that even seasoned royal reporters dared not print every word. Because this was not simply a meeting. It was an ambush. It was a duel. And it was a countdown to a single moment that would change everything. Perhaps it was only a private secretary, perhaps a security officer gliding silently past. But whoever it was, their presence was not random. No one was to greet Harry. No nods, no polite smiles, no fleeting touches of warmth. Because in Clarence House, warmth could be mistaken for loyalty, and loyalty here had to be either earned or withdrawn. For Harry, it was a blow, a sudden realization of just how much this place had changed. Once Clarence House had been the closest thing to refuge he had. After Diana's death tore his world apart, Charles had brought William and Harry here, hoping the house's quiet dignity could shelter them from the storm outside. And for a brief moment it worked. Harry could still remember building Lego castles on Persian rugs, curling in his father's lap by the fireplace, feeling, if only briefly, protected. But as he walked through those same rooms now, he felt like a stranger in a museum of his own childhood. A childhood stolen, its warmth preserved only in artifacts and shadows. Somewhere in another room, a clock struck. Not the soft, homely chime of a grandfather clock, but a sharp metallic note, dry, unwelcoming, a reminder you are on his time now. And with every step forward, another truth pressed down on him. Clarence House wasn't just Charles's residence, it was the beating heart of the monarchy. Strategies were forged here like weapons, press narratives shaped here like steel, rivals silenced, alliances sealed. The building itself had outlasted ministers, wars, scandals, abdications. Its walls carried centuries of scheming. Harry could feel it like an electric current woven into the wallpaper. He wasn't simply walking through a house, he was walking through the operating system of the crown. Imagine the weight of that, every object older than your own struggles yet still part of them. Every tapestry, every vase marked with a crest, every portrait framed in gold whispered the same message: you will leave, we will remain. That was Clarence House speaking to him in silence. No wonder his chest tightened, but there was something deeper, something more dangerous coursing beneath the surface: division. The house was no longer united behind its king, not fully, not anymore. Harry could sense it, the stiffness in certain staff members, the downward glances, the fleeting looks heavy with pity, the subtle fractures of loyalty. Some saw him as a traitor who had betrayed blood and duty. Others still saw him as the lost prince, the boy who might yet return. It was chilling to realize, a palace can rot from within even as its exterior gleams. The gallery of portraits hit him hardest. There, hanging in full form, was an oil painting of Charles as Prince of Wales. Young, clad in military uniform, eyes alight with ambition. Beside it, a smaller photograph, Harry at his Sandhurst graduation. Charles's hand resting firmly on his shoulder. Once that gesture had meant comfort. Now Harry saw it differently: possession. He stared until his throat tightened. Then he turned sharply before the watching aide could decipher the emotion written across his face. The fracture wasn't only in the people, it was in the walls themselves. Clarence House was a labyrinth designed with separation in mind. Corridors bending into corridors, staircases splitting paths. It was a residence built not to unite but to divide, so that members of the household might live under one roof yet remain apart. Charles's apartments filled one floor, Camilla's stretched into another wing, guest suites scattered like islands across the estate. Unity as a facade. Distance as a way of survival. And Harry, at that moment, was stepping straight into the core of that illusion. He arrived at the green drawing room, once his favorite corner, a space bathed in garden light, walls dressed in floral fabrics, a place that had felt safe. But now, enemy ground. He remembered curling there as a boy, listening to his father read, imagining a world less cruel than the one outside. The room had been soft then, almost maternal in its comfort. Today it felt staged. The flowers too perfect. The curtains too heavy, even the light itself seemed filtered, dimmed as though to rob the room of warmth. Harry's gaze lingered on the fireplace. He saw not logs and ash but memories flickering. How many nights had he sat there, wondering why the love that should have come so easily in a family felt rationed, conditional. And then movement, the faint creak of a floorboard behind the wall, a presence unseen, an ear pressed where it should not be. Clarence House was never truly private. Even in its silence there were always witnesses, always someone listening. Harry's jaw tightened, he knew what was coming. And in that moment he braced, not for a father's welcome but for an interrogation disguised as conversation. The morning room awaited, the place where his father waited not as a parent but as a monarch cloaked in centuries of power. And the clock ticked louder. Tick-tock tick. A countdown to the confrontation that would leave the world guessing. Two attendants stood like statues on opposite walls, hands clasped, faces expressionless. They did not greet him, and he did not acknowledge them. The silence that surrounded them was not empty, it was charged with history, heavy with the unspoken weight of centuries. Harry stood firm in the center of the rug. He did not sit, he did not touch a single object. To lean back, to reach for comfort, would have been to reveal vulnerability, and vulnerability had no place here. This was not a family reunion, it was a duel, and he knew it. The floorboards creaked, a murmur drifted from the other side of the door, his heartbeat quickened. The king was approaching, but there was something else. This was more than a meeting of father and son, it was a ritual of dominance. Clarence House was designed for this. The towering ceilings, the ancestral portraits looming like silent judges, the calculated placement of Charles's chair near the fireplace, slightly raised so visitors were forced to look upward, all of it was psychological theater dressed in elegant decor. Harry understood it. That was what made it so dangerous, because if his father came expecting submission, he wouldn't find it. Harry had come prepared to resist. The voices behind the door hushed. The golden handle turned slowly. Attendants straightened like marionettes pulled taut. The moment had arrived. Harry clenched his jaw, squared his shoulders. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. The door opened. Charles entered. But he was not alone. And the figure who followed him would ignite the spark that set everything ablaze. There is something more powerful than a shout. It is silence sharpened into a blade. That was what sliced through the room when the king crossed the threshold, his robes brushed softly, his expression carved in stone. Harry had expected coldness. He had expected disdain. What he had not expected was the suffocating weight that fell over the room like a shadow extinguishing the light. He was not alone. Sliding in behind him was Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, a man as inseparable from the machinery of monarchy as the crown itself. His expression unreadable, his posture flawless, his eyes cold, polished like glass. His very presence was a message. This was not a conversation between father and son. This was the crown confronting a threat. Charles walked to the center of the carpet and sat in the armchair positioned with mathematical precision, the sunlight angled to cast a halo on his head. Sir Clive remained standing by the mantelpiece, notebook under his arm like a weapon. Harry did not bow, not this time. Instead, he offered only the briefest, stiffest nod, military, not filial, the kind of acknowledgement a soldier gives a commanding officer before combat. For a fleeting second, Charles's brow arched. Irritation, surprise, perhaps he had expected remorse. Instead, he found defiance. No embrace, no handshake, no smile. The clock on the wall struck each second with punishing clarity. Tick, tock, tick. Finally, Charles broke the silence with 4 words. You chose this path. They were not spoken like reproach, they were spoken like sentence. Dry, cold, final, no warmth in the voice, not even anger, just a verbal scalpel cutting the room in two. Harry felt the blow like a strike to the chest. A tremor ran through him, invisible to most, though Sir Clive's sharp eyes caught it. Inside, Harry shook like beams in an old house under strain, but outwardly his face remained stone. The message was clear. This was not reconciliation, this was judgment. Harry drew a breath and answered. I chose survival. The words were soft but heavy, raw. For the first time, a reaction cracked across Charles's face, a tightening of the jaw, fleeting but real. Harry had rehearsed it, that much was clear. This wasn't an impulsive reply, it was a shield forged long before he ever stepped foot into that room. Survival, Charles repeated, tasting the word as though it were foreign. You call this survival? It was the first fissure in his controlled exterior, a blade of steel flashing beneath the calm. Harry did not flinch. And what would you call it? Running before the machine swallowed me whole, escaping before it devoured me alive. From the corner, Sir Clive shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. A signal, he too felt the temperature rising. Charles leaned back, fingers interlocked. His voice cut the air like frost. You abandoned your duty, you abandoned your family, and then you turned against it. He left a pause, heavy, dense, then added, each word dropping like lead. Even her. He didn't name her, he didn't need to. Every person in that room knew, not Camilla, not Meghan, the late Queen Elizabeth II. That was the wound Charles could never close. Harry's departure had coincided with his mother's final decline. To Charles, it was betrayal in her most fragile hour. I never turned against her, Harry snapped back, his voice steady but his eyes sharp as steel. I turned against those who made her suffer, those who disguised cruelty as service. The silence that followed was electric. It was the kind of silence that vibrates, that hums with unspoken danger. Harry had crossed a forbidden line. To question the system was one thing, to question Charles directly unforgivable. The king's lips pressed into a white line, his gaze hardened to ice. "You have become a spectacle," he said at last, his tone low but venomous, more cutting than any shout. "Television interviews, memoirs, podcasts, tearing down what others built." Harry shot back, quick, unwavering, "Or protecting myself with the only weapon I had, truth, and truth should not burn unless it is built on lies." The words hung in the air like a headline waiting to be printed. Perhaps that was Harry's intent, to remind Charles that nothing said in this room was truly safe, that any word could explode beyond these walls. Charles's eyes flickered, just briefly, toward the faint bulge in Harry's jacket pocket, that barely perceptible shape many suspected might conceal a recording device. The atmosphere thickened, heavy, charged like the air before lightning strikes. Sir Clive's eyes darted between them, measuring, calculating risk. This was no meeting, this was tectonic plates colliding, ego against ego, history against rebellion, father against son. Charles leaned forward, lowered his voice to a whisper sharper than a scream. "You speak of truth," he said, "but every word you feed them." He gestured faintly toward the invisible swarm of tabloids and cameras waiting beyond the palace gates, "kills another piece of this family. Do you think they care for you? They will devour you. And when they are done, they will scatter your bones across the Atlantic." Harry's eyes blazed. "Better that," he replied, his voice steady, "than to let them bury me alive here." The words froze Charles, because in them lay not just defiance, but a son's deepest wound. And though the king did not answer, the silence that followed was louder than thunder. It sounded like metaphor, but it was confession. In Harry's voice there was a tone barely perceptible, the faint echo of nights darker than the press had ever dared to print, and for a heartbeat, just a single pulse, something flickered across Charles's face. Humanity, worry, maybe even regret. But just as quickly it vanished, a shadow swept away by the passing of a cloud. "You are still my son," Charles said at last. The words landed heavy, almost unnatural, as though they had been ripped out against his will. Harry's reply was quiet, but sharp enough to slice through the room like fire. "Am I really?" The words cracked like a gunshot in a cathedral. And in that instant the air shifted. Until now it had been a duel of ripostes, a sparring of words, but now it was blood. The question had pierced the royal armor and struck the man beneath. Charles turned his eyes to the flames in the fireplace as if he might find escape in their dance. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Harry rose, not violently but with a controlled precision that sent a ripple through the atmosphere. He walked to the window. Outside, the gardens lay pristine. Beyond the iron gates, journalists waited with cameras ready, poised to devour any glimpse of movement from inside Clarence House. Did they know? Harry wondered. Did they realize they were about to capture not just photographs but history in real time? He turned back toward his father, his voice calm, deliberate. "If you brought me here expecting an apology, you're going to be disappointed." Charles's eyes whipped back to him, sharp as a lash. This time there was no mask, no royal stillness, only raw fury burning hot as coals. "I didn't want an apology," Charles spat. "I wanted to know if there was anything left of you." The words hit like a hammer. Even Sir Clive, standing by the mantel with his notebook, seemed to stop breathing. Harry clenched his jaw. He did not answer right away. He stood still, inhaling, exhaling, as if restraining himself from striking back with his fists instead of words, and in that silence it became undeniable. There was nothing to salvage. This was not reconciliation. This was collision. Two worlds, one ancient dynasty and another trying to be born, both trapped inside a gilded cage. Harry opened his mouth to respond, but Charles cut him off. "One word, a name." "Megan." He didn't say it gently, he spat it, harsh, bitter, like expelling a poison seed that had festered for years. The syllable cracked across the room like a whip. The air turned toxic in an instant. Harry's shoulders tensed. His jaw trembled barely, he didn't blink, didn't flinch, he simply met his father's stare, and in that stare burned a storm. "She's hollowed you out," Charles said, his voice tight, coiled, venom dripping from every syllable. "Piece by piece, she's stripped you until I barely recognize what's left." He did not shout, he didn't need to. Every word slid like a blade beneath Harry's skin. "What remains in me," Harry answered, his voice taut as a bowstring ready to release an arrow, "is the part you never tried to know." Sir Clive did not move. He stood rigid, frozen like a statue witnessing history with horror. The tension suffocated the air, drained it until it felt the room was starved of oxygen. Because now it was not just about a wife. It was about excavation. A brutal digging up of wounds buried for decades under protocol, public smiles, and polished family portraits. And they were about to be unearthed. Charles's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles whitening. His voice hissed like steel. "We welcomed her, do not twist the story, we bent traditions, we endured her storms, and what did we receive in return? Accusations, chaos, lies dressed up as grievances." Harry's voice rose not in volume but in force, a flame given oxygen. "You didn't welcome her, you tolerated her like a bomb about to explode. You smiled while your courtiers drained her life away, and when she bled, you blamed her for bleeding." Charles's eyes flared, his lips curled with rage. "She sought attention like it was air, she suffocated here and you knew it," Harry shot back. It was like watching continents collide. Each sentence dragged years of silence into the open. Meghan's tears behind closed doors, Charles's stony silence in the middle of the storm, the royal machine grinding down anything it could not control. But beneath Meghan's shadow there was something older, deeper, far more dangerous. She was the spark. The fuel had been gathering for decades. And then Diana. Charles mentioned her first, perhaps without meaning to. His voice broke through, low, strained. "You're not the only one who's lost," he muttered. Harry's face changed in an instant. Pain, fury, grief, all fused into something fierce, something volcanic. "Don't," he warned, his voice was sharp, glass about to shatter. "You think you own her memory?" Charles snapped, his voice cracking like something brittle under pressure. "You believe only you loved her, that only you carry the scar, you wield her ghost like a sword." The words slammed into Harry like a punch. For the first time his mask wavered, his voice trembled, raw, unstable like the earth before an earthquake. "You destroyed her," Harry said, "and then buried her pain beneath statements and silence. You taught me to smile for cameras while my heart rotted." The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the fire seemed to dim. Sir Clive shifted his eyes toward the door, calculating whether he should intervene, wondering if this had crossed the line from confrontation into something dangerous. Charles stared at his son as if seeing him for the first time, not as a boy, not as the rebel prince, but as the living embodiment of every ghost he had tried to leave behind. And then something no one expected. The king's voice cracked again, not with rage but with something painfully human. "I stayed," he whispered. "I stayed through humiliation, through hatred, through years of scorn. I stayed because duty demanded it." Harry froze, his breath caught in his throat. "You didn't stay," Harry whispered back. "You died here slowly." The words dropped between them like a guillotine. It was no longer father versus son, it was prisoner versus survivor. Charles rose suddenly, the movement sharp enough to echo against the floorboards. Attendants outside the door stiffened at the sound. His face had gone pale, his fury frozen into ice. "Do you have any idea," Charles thundered, not in volume but in venom, "what you've done to this family, to the crown, to this country?" Harry rose too, eyes ablaze. "Do you have any idea what this family did to me?" And there it was, the deepest wound torn wide open. This wasn't about Meghan, or Diana, or duty. This was about a son who had begged for love and received protocol, and a father who had demanded obedience and received rebellion. And in that poisoned silence you could almost hear it, the sound of something breaking, not in the room but between them. Harry lowered his voice to a whisper. You lost me years ago, today you're only. And before the sentence could end, the fire inside Clarence House burned hotter than it had in decades. It wasn't just a statement, it was an admission. Harry's words had carried a resonance, an undertone that sounded less like rhetoric and more like confession. Somewhere in his voice lurked shadows the tabloids had never captured, nights of despair darker than anyone outside those walls could imagine. For the first time the king faltered, Charles's lips parted but no words emerged, silence, a monarch speechless. And then a sound. A knock. Soft, controlled, but in that suffocating silence it was deafening. Both men turned sharply toward the door. Whoever dared to interrupt was walking into a storm and might unleash something even worse. The knock came again, steady, measured, like a metronome ticking down toward detonation. The door creaked open just an inch. A pale-faced aide slipped inside, head bowed, voice trembling. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "there is an issue with the press at the gates. They are convinced a reconciliation is taking place and demand a statement." Charles's jaw locked. He didn't look at the aide, he didn't look at Harry, his words were clipped, glacial. "Leave." The aide vanished instantly, and the door shut again. Charles turned back to his son, his eyes cold as marble. "Reconciliation," he repeated, curling his lip in bitter disdain. "They expect a fairy tale, a staged photograph, the prodigal son embraced by his father. You've trained them well." Harry's brow furrowed, his voice cut back like a blade. "And who leaked this meeting? Who told them to wait? It wasn't me." Charles's tone rose not in volume but in edge, each word sharpened to a knife point. "You have made exposure your trade, airing grievances before the world, turning private moments into currency. Forgive me if I doubt your sudden vow of discretion." The accusation landed like shrapnel. Everyone had known it was coming, but still it hit with the violence of an explosion. Harry pressed his lips together, then fired back. "Do you think I wanted this public? Do you think I chose to be dissected and watched like an insect under glass? I waited just to see if you'd look at me." Charles leaned forward, eyes burning. "You became a spectacle, you torched the bridges and then complained of the cold." Harry's voice tore through the air. "I told the truth." The silence that followed was so thick it pressed on the chest. Even Sir Clive, usually stone, held his breath a beat too long before masking it again. Charles's reply came low, deadly. "No, you told your version, a story embellished, pain spun into performance. You've turned suffering into theater." Harry stepped forward, lowered his voice, but the words seared hotter than fire. "You call it performance because you never speak anything real. Every smile, every speech, every glance rehearsed. You speak through statements. I couldn't breathe in that world, and you were too busy polishing the crown to notice I was suffocating." The king surged to his feet. The scrape of the chair against the rug ripped the air like claws. "You humiliated this family across continents." His tone cracked as it climbed, fury fraying the edges. "Televised interviews, that so-called memoir. Do you understand what it meant, what it felt like to sit on the throne of a 1,000-year institution while your own son called it a golden prison on primetime television?" Harry's chest heaved, but his words shot back with steel. "And do you know what it felt like to live in that prison while the world worshipped it as a palace? To watch it chew my wife alive, to be headlines instead of human? You don't get to play victim of the truth." The words detonated like lightning. Charles's hands trembled barely before he clasped them behind his back. His eyes glimmered with more than rage, for a fleeting second something else, shame, perhaps even fear. "You broke the pact," he whispered, "the unspoken covenant that keeps this house standing. Discretion, silence, you shattered it." Harry stepped closer. Maybe it deserved to be broken. For a moment Charles froze, not rebellion, heresy. Because the monarchy had survived centuries by one principle: no matter the storms inside, they never spilled beyond the walls, and Harry had obliterated that code. Deep down, perhaps Charles knew his son was right, but he would never admit it. Instead, he spun sharply toward the fire, his voice rising like thunder. Do you think this family survived empires, wars, scandals, assassination attempts by bleeding in public? We endured because we are more than human, because we do not show wounds. But you, Harry, you bled in front of every camera, and then you acted surprised when the sharks arrived. Harry's response came almost as a growl. I bled because silence was killing me, because in this family, love means pretending pain doesn't exist. Charles whipped around, eyes blazing. You are not the only one who suffered. Harry's voice sliced through like a knife. But I am the only one you left to drown. The silence that followed was seismic. And then the second accusation, more dangerous than the first. Charles stepped forward, lowering his voice to a deadly whisper. You recorded this meeting. Harry's face froze, utterly still. Yes, you did, Charles pressed, every syllable dripping threat. If a single word escapes these walls, I will burn every last bridge that remains between us. Harry did not blink. And if I did, his voice was quiet, controlled. It would only be to protect myself, to shield myself from being shredded by your machine. It was confession and warning. Sir Clive's head snapped up, a visible crack in his composure. Charles's face flushed crimson, fury boiling through his skin. You would threaten your own father. Harry's voice was calm, steady, immovable. I would do what it takes to survive. The words landed like a bomb. For the first time, Charles recoiled not in fear but in stunned rage. He realized then Harry was no longer pleading for acceptance, he was declaring independence. The battle lines had been drawn. And in the corridor beyond, faint but unmistakable, the thud of boots approached, fast. Someone had heard the shouting, someone was coming. Have you ever heard something so raw it made your skin prickle yet you couldn't stop listening? That was the staff in Clarence House that day. Never had voices risen like this inside those walls. Not here where disputes were smothered under silk rugs and centuries of protocol. But now shouts cracked the oak panels like lightning-splitting trees. The entire residence held its breath. 2 footmen stood rigid at either end of the corridor, eyes fixed forward, bodies like statues though their hands clenched white behind their backs. Their duty was silence, neutrality meant survival, but even they trembled. Farther down the hall, a maid paused mid-polish on a silver railing. Her rags circled mechanically but her head tilted ever so slightly, ears straining. In Clarence House that was how you survived. Pretend to ignore the thunder, never miss a flash of lightning. A crash jolted the air, something had struck a table. A teacup perhaps, or the pen clutched in Sir Clive's hand. The maid flinched. The nearest footman inhaled sharply, then masked his face again. Because they all knew the truth. These walls had ears, and those ears served the crown. Every royal residence was a labyrinth of whispers, a nervous system of aides, butlers, maids, and drivers absorbing secrets like sponges. Nothing remained hidden forever. And in that moment, the entire system quaked. For the first time in living memory, Clarence House was being torn apart from within. Muffled voices leaked through the door, Harry's words rapid, tumbling like stones down a cliff. Then Charles's voice, deep, thunderous, rattling the walls. The sound of something small hitting the floor. The air in the corridor thickened. 2 security men emerged from a side passage, moving silently in dark suits. Their earpieces glinted under the chandelier. They positioned themselves within meters of the morning room door. They said nothing, but their posture screamed alert. This was not routine. Normally, they were invisible, only summoned if needed. For them to stand guard so visibly, so close, meant only one thing. They had been told to be ready. Inside, the voices dipped lower, still sharp, still cutting. The storm had not passed, it was only waiting to strike again. The calm was deceptive. Low voices, blades sheathed. That kind of silence was worse than shouting. A silence so dense, so threatening, it pressed against the walls like the eye of a hurricane. The maid who had lingered by the railing retreated slowly, head bowed, as if trying to erase her presence from existence. One guard lifted his wrist and murmured into his mic, too quiet to catch. But seconds later, another agent appeared at the far end of the corridor. They weren't there to repel an intruder, they were preparing for what might soon come out of that room. A cavalry aide appeared next, cheeks flushed red from sprinting up 2 flights. He stopped cold at the sight of the guards, whispered something quickly. The taller guard shook his head once, just once. The aide's face shifted, fear, then calculation. And then he backed away. That was the instinct of Clarence House staff in that moment, not to predict who would win but to guess who might survive. Because Clarence House had always run on hierarchy, discipline, order, but in that instant it was splintering in real time. The king and his son weren't just fighting, they were ripping open the very fabric of the crown. Even the building seemed to sense it. Crystal chandeliers quivered with every slammed word, dust drifted from the ornate plaster ceilings above. A grandfather clock chimed with elegant serenity, absurd against the chaos unfolding below. In the corridor, a guard's radio crackled faintly. "Hold position, prepare extraction protocol if necessary." Extraction protocol. The youngest footman's stomach twisted. It meant someone was about to be removed physically from Clarence House, and there were only 2 men in that room. Then came the sound. A violent scrape of chair legs across the rug, heavy boots pivoting on the carpet, voices rising again so loud they blurred into a roar. And then nothing. A silence so total it froze the corridor into a tableau, guards braced, servants rigid, behind the frosted glass Sir Clive's silhouette unmoving. "Stand by," the taller guard whispered, low enough that only his partner heard. Everyone felt it, something was about to snap. And when it did, it would no longer be a family argument, it would be an exodus. From inside came Charles's voice, thin, cold, carved in ice. "She is the reason this family is rotting." The words hit the corridor like shrapnel, not for what they accused, but for what came after. Harry's reply ripped through the door, a guttural roar, his voice cracking for the first time. "And you are the reason she is broken." The staff outside inhaled sharply together. Then a crash. The unmistakable shatter of glass. The guards moved instantly, lunging toward the door. This was no longer private dispute, it was now a matter of security. And yet no one crossed the threshold, not yet. They waited, because crossing meant escalation, and escalation might mean the collapse of everything. Inside, shards glittered across the carpet, reflecting the firelight like fragments of a grenade. The silence that followed clawed at the walls. How can someone absent dominate a room? Meghan Markle was not in Clarence House, not her body, not her voice, but she was everywhere. In Charles's rigid posture, in the crack of Harry's trembling voice, in the atmosphere taut and brittle as a sky moments before thunder. Her name had always been the invisible wall, avoided in interviews, buried in carefully phrased statements, ignored in sterile press releases. But Charles had spat it now, spat it like venom. And the ghost of that name hovered, demanding reckoning. "This is all her fault," Harry finally thundered, his voice vibrating not with fear but with fury. "It's easier to blame her than to face what you created." Charles's fists clenched at his sides. "She destroyed the credibility of this family, every gesture, every complaint flung before the world." "She told the truth," Harry shot back. "She told her truth," Charles snapped, knowing it would set fire to us all. Harry's eyes blazed. "We were already burning, she just stopped pretending those flames were candlelight." The word struck like thunder. Charles's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. His voice rose higher, more primal. "She sowed division, she played victim while wielding the knife, she drove staff to tears, she shattered protocol. Camilla nearly walked out of this house because of her." "Because you treated her like an experiment," Harry lashed back, "like she wasn't flesh and blood, just a test the monarchy wanted to see fail." Charles stepped closer, fury radiating off him. She turned you against us. Harry stood his ground. You did that yourself. She was the only one who reached out a hand. The silence that followed was poison. By the mantel, Clive's knuckles whitened around his notebook. His eyes flicked to the shards of broken glass sparkling across the rug. The guards outside stood still, ears ringing with every muffled word. You've let her rewrite you, Charles said finally, his voice softer now but far more lethal. The boy I raised would never have done this. The man standing in front of me is not him. Harry's voice dropped to a whisper. Maybe the boy you raised was only pretending to survive. Maybe this man is what was left after your silence killed the rest. Charles blinked, stunned. It was the most honest thing Harry had ever said to him, and perhaps that was why Charles hated it. Because it rang true. He turned abruptly, striding toward the window. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. No crown, but unmistakably a king. His voice cracked when he spoke again. Do you think I don't know what it is to be misunderstood, to be despised by the one you love, to be painted villain for following your heart? For a moment he was raw, almost human, a flicker of his own scars, Camilla, decades of scandal, years as the villain in Diana's tragedy. Harry saw it and he attacked. Then you should have stood up, Harry shot. You should have said, she is my son's wife. If you attack her, you answer to me. But you didn't, you hid, you let them tear her apart while you smiled for the cameras. Charles's face twisted with something dark, raw. If I had defended her, they would have come for all of us. The crown does not bend for individuals, not even for love. Harry laughed, a sound hollow, sharp, metallic. Then what is the point? What worth is a family that won't fight for its own? The point, Charles answered, voice slamming shut like a door, is survival. The word ricocheted off the walls like gunfire. Harry's face changed, not pain, not fury, something else, determination. Then you can survive without me, he said. The air froze. Charles's eyes narrowed. Is that a threat? It's a promise, Harry said, calm as stone. For a long moment they stared, two men bound by blood, separated by betrayal. Then Charles delivered the line that tilted the confrontation into freefall. She will destroy you, he said, his voice quiet, almost pitying. Harry didn't blink. She saved me. He didn't shout, he didn't defy, he simply stated it as if carved into granite. And in that moment, Charles stopped seeing a son to be rescued. He saw an adversary, a man who had chosen love over the monarchy, a man who would not return. Charles's posture shifted, shoulders squared, chin lifted, a general bracing for war. Outside the door the guards adjusted, sensing the shift in current. Clive's pen hovered, suspended mid-sentence. Everyone in that room knew what was coming. Words were no longer enough, consequences were on their way. And then it happened. A sound small, almost imperceptible. A faint beep. From the pocket of Harry's jacket. Charles's eyes snapped to it, his voice turned to ice. That's a recording. A simple sound, barely audible, but it detonated the room like a grenade. Charles's gaze locked on Harry's jacket. Harry's hand moved instinctively, a reflex. And that movement alone was confirmation. Under the fabric, a red light flickered once, then went dark. Clive's eyes widened. The king's fury reached its breaking point. And what came next would shake Clarence House to its foundations. For the first time that day, Charles's eyes widened. It's a recording, he repeated. Softer this time, but so cold it froze the air in the room. Harry didn't move, didn't blink. His face hardened into marble, chiseled from defiance and fear. And in that instant, Clarence House stopped being a room, it became a crime scene. Charles straightened slowly, each vertebra locking into place like a drawbridge rising. Answer me, he demanded, now. Silence. Harry's jaw tightened, the muscle twitching beneath the skin. Finally, he spoke. I will never be silenced again. The words were flat, but they landed heavier than any shout. Clive inhaled sharply, the sound of air slicing into lungs that hadn't dared to move. Are you recording me? Charles's voice cracked, not just with anger, not just with disbelief, but with something darker, betrayal. You brought a device into my house, into this room, into this family. Harry's reply was barely more than a whisper, but it carried steel. I brought the truth because it dies here. Those words hit harder than a scream. At that moment, Charles stopped looking at his son as a wounded father. He looked at him as an enemy. You think this will protect you, Charles hissed. You believe blackmail will make you safe. Harry's voice stayed calm, too calm. I believe truth might. If you or your machine try to bury me again, the world will hear what really happened here. It was like watching a man leap off a cliff willingly, knowing there was no return. Clive's voice cracked through the silence, sharp, nervous, almost panicked. Your Majesty, if there is a device. Silence, Charles cut him off, eyes never leaving Harry. He stepped closer, voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Do you understand what you've done? If this leaks, if a single word escapes, you won't just destroy me, you'll end the monarchy. Harry's voice wavered, but not with fear, with emotion. It destroyed me first. From outside, guards shifted closer, their instincts flaring. What had been tension was now danger. Charles advanced, hands trembling, his voice climbing with every step. You have no idea the chaos you will unleash. A constitutional crisis, public outrage, Parliament forced to intervene. This is bigger than you, Harry, bigger than me. Harry's eyes sparked, burning with the kind of clarity that frightens even kings. Then maybe it's time the world saw how small you really are. Charles froze, the words hovered between them like smoke. And then he laughed. Not a laugh of joy, not even of humor, but a hollow, jagged sound, almost disbelief. You think you can burn down 1,000 years with a single recording? His voice vibrated with fury. You think the world would choose you over the crown? Harry stepped forward, his voice steady. I don't need them to choose me, I just need them to see me. And there it was, the truth at the heart of it all. Not revenge, not rebellion, not even victory, recognition. Not as a headline, not as a traitor, not as a shadow of his mother, but as himself. And that perhaps was the most dangerous thing of all, because if the public saw him, truly saw him, they might begin to question the palace that had erased him. Charles's breathing was ragged now, harsh, his face pale, almost gray. For a fleeting second he didn't look like a king, he looked like an old man staring at the cracks in his empire. Turn it off, he ordered, his voice torn, desperate. Harry didn't move. Turn it off, Charles repeated louder, or I swear I'll have security drag you and that device out of this house. Still Harry stood still, silent, eyes locked on his father. You wouldn't dare, he whispered. And why not? Charles's voice sliced between them like gas to a flame. Then Clive moved, quickly, breaking the spell. He stepped forward, voice trembling yet firm. This cannot continue, Your Majesty, if there is a device. Out, Charles's roar cut him like a whip. Clive froze. Out, Charles repeated. Clive vanished, the door shutting softly behind him. Now there were only two, father and son, and the silent red eye in Harry's pocket. Charles's voice dropped to a whisper sharp enough to shatter glass. If you leave this room with that recording, you will never enter again, not this house, not this family, not this kingdom. Harry's reply was almost inaudible. Maybe I knew that the moment I walked in. The silence that followed was unbearable. Outside, guards murmured into radios. The corridor stretched taut like a wire pulled to breaking. From deep inside the residence, the quarter-hour bells rang, 4 notes marking 45 minutes. 9 minutes until history imploded. Charles surged forward, his fury spilling out. If that audio sees light, the monarchy falls. Harry's eyes did not waver. Maybe it should. Charles blinked. And in that blink something broke. Not in the room, but in him. His shoulders sagged, his face sagged. For the briefest moment, the mask of majesty cracked, revealing the ghost of a man behind the crown. I have given my life, he began. And then the words caught in his throat. Because for the first time in that room, it was no longer king against prince, no longer monarchy against rebellion. It was just a father and a son, staring at the ruins between them. Charles's voice trembled, the words escaping like steam from a cracked pipe. "I gave my life to this family," he whispered, "and you would throw it to the wolves." Harry's reply was just as fractured, just as raw. "I gave my soul to this family, and it left me starving." The brief flicker of humanity that had softened Charles's face hardened again, tempered into steel, quenched in ice. "It's over," he said flatly. Harry's chest heaved, ragged disbelief spilling into his voice. "What do you mean?" Charles took a single step back, straightened, lifted his chin. When he spoke, it was no longer as a father, it was as a king. "You will leave this house." Harry's chest rose sharply, like a blade piercing through him. "You will leave now," Charles continued, his voice like thunder muffled by velvet, "or I will have you escorted out." The words didn't sound like anger, they sounded like a death sentence. Harry stood frozen. The clock on the mantel ticked louder, then louder still, as if time itself was gasping. Outside, the guards straightened, their instincts sharpened, they could feel it. The meeting was no longer tense, it was about to detonate. "Will you walk out of this house right now?" Charles demanded. Silence. His voice rose, sharp as glass shattering. "Now, Harry." Nothing. Not even the ticking of the clock could be heard anymore. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Harry's jaw clenched. When he finally spoke, his voice shook, not with weakness but with fury. "I came here in good faith to talk, to try, and you turned it into a trial." "This was not a trial," Charles replied, his tones slicing the air. "A trial implies there was a chance for redemption." The words cracked like a whip. Harry flinched, not visibly, not enough for the guards outside to see, but inside the blow landed. His face stilled. "Then this was useless," he said coldly. "Yes," Charles answered, "it was." Behind the door, the guards exchanged the briefest glance. Subtle as a shadow, they could sense it. The line had been crossed. This wasn't tension anymore, it was execution. Charles stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You have defamed this family, poisoned the people against their future king, made a mockery of everything this crown stands for, and now, you dare record me in my own house." "I told my story," Harry snapped. "You sold it," Charles spat, "like currency, like gossip. You traded our blood for your catharsis." Harry's reply landed like a hammer. "I bled first." Charles froze for half a heartbeat, then the mask returned. His tone dropped, low and lethal. "You are not welcome here anymore." Air caught in Harry's throat, a sharp, involuntary gasp. Because those words weren't anger, they were exile. "You can't mean that," he whispered. "I mean it," Charles said, "and I will hold it until my last breath." Harry's voice broke. "I'm your son." "You were," Charles answered, his eyes cold, his tone colder. "Now you are a threat." It was the killing blow. Not born of fury, born of ice, and that made it worse. Harry's fists clenched, his knuckles bone-white. "If I walk out that door, I never come back." "Then don't walk back," Charles said. The words detonated in the room like a gunshot. And everything shattered. Harry stepped forward, closing the gap until his face was inches from his father's, his eyes blazing, his breath ragged. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Charles didn't flinch, his voice was quiet, deadly. "The one who will regret it is you." And then it happened. Charles raised his hand, not to strike, not to push, but as a signal. The door swung open instantly. 2 guards stepped in, silent, calculated, expressionless. Harry's head snapped toward them, disbelief cutting across his face. "You called security on me." "I brought war to my house," Charles replied, his voice hollow, final. The guards positioned themselves behind Harry, close enough to be felt, not close enough to touch, waiting, breathing, ready. Harry's chest rose and fell heavy, his voice cracked into a bitter half-laugh, half-growl. "You'd rather drag me out than speak to me." "I have spoken to you for years," Charles shot back, and all you ever did was listen for ammunition. Because ammunition, Harry spat, was the only thing you ever gave me. Charles's eyes hardened, flat, merciless. Leave. Harry didn't move. Leave, Charles repeated, sharper this time. The guards shifted, tension in every muscle. Harry turned slowly, his eyes locked onto each of them. They didn't blink. They weren't men anymore, they were the crowns wool wrapped in immaculate suits. Harry's gaze returned to his father. And in that moment, something inside him broke, silently, cleanly, like glass cracking under frost. Goodbye, he whispered. He stepped toward the door. The guards followed, their boots whispering across the carpet like iron shadows. At the threshold, Harry stopped. For a moment, he just stood there, shoulders heaving, trying to remember how to breathe. Then slowly he turned his head, just enough for their eyes to meet. Father, son, king, outcast. For the first time since the beginning, neither spoke, and that silence was louder than words. Harry turned back, walked out. The guards followed, their boots scraping softly against the rug. The door closed. And that was it. 54 minutes after it began, the meeting ended. Inside, Charles stood alone, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. Outside, the storm erupted. Harry descended the marble steps, his jaw locked, his eyes blazing, his coat whipping in the wind. The flashes exploded like lightning. The shutters fired like gunshots. Harry, did the meeting go well? Harry, will there be reconciliation? Harry, has the king forgiven you? Harry didn't answer, didn't look at them, didn't even seem to hear. He walked straight to the car, yanked the door open, disappeared inside. The door slammed, the engine roared, the black SUV pulled from the curb like a vehicle fleeing a crime scene. And to the world beyond the gates, that was the end. A failed meeting, a storm hidden behind curtains. But inside Clarence House, the storm was still alive. Because Charles remained in the morning room, frozen, alone, eyes fixed on the empty chair Harry had left behind. And he still hadn't noticed the smallest, most dangerous thing of all. A shard of glass on the carpet. A sliver of metal embedded in the rug. Something that hadn't been there before the explosion. Something that didn't belong.